Sean todas y todos bienvenidos a la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. En esta ocasión, en el ciclo de conferencias, grandes protagonistas de las ciencias sociales, de las ciencias políticas y sociales, nos engalana la presencia del doctor Jean-Frédéric Morin con su conferencia La fragmentación de la gobernanza global, implicaciones para la política exterior. Nos acompañan en este destacado presidium el doctor Alejandro Chanona Burguete, director de nuestra facultad. El doctor Jean-Frédéric Morin. El maestro Marco Antonio Lopátegui Torres, coordinador del Centro de Relaciones Internacionales. El maestro Edgar Maqueda, de la Coordinación de Idiomas. En primer lugar, damos el uso de la voz a nuestro director, el doctor Alejandro Chanona Burguete.
Muy buenos días a todas y todos. Good morning, bonjour. Doctor Jean-Frédéric Morin, sea usted bienvenido a la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Es un honor recibirlo en esta casa y agradecerle profundamente que participe en el ciclo de conferencias Grandes Protagonistas de las Ciencias Políticas y Sociales, organizado por nuestra facultad en el marco del 75 aniversario de nuestra facultad. Me estaba yo acordando cómo se dice 75 en francés. 50, ok. 60, ok. Ese es nuestro aniversario, 75 anniversary, yes, indeed. Gracias. Saludo con gusto al maestro Marco Antonio Lopátegui Torres, coordinador del Centro de Relaciones Internacionales. Desde luego agradezco mucho la presencia del profesor Edgar Maqueda, que cualquier dudita le vamos a estar preguntando sobre algunas traducciones como el aniversario que ahorita le preguntaba. Y desde luego me da mucho gusto, además de saludar con mucho cariño al estudiantado para quien está dirigido este ciclo de grandes protagonistas, saludar a integrantes de nuestra comunidad, gentes del claustro, profesoras y profesores que nos acompañan esta mañana. Reglas del juego, comentábamos el documento de presentación magistral del doctor Morin, va a ser en español, me dijo, va a ser en español. Él va a entregar su presentación en inglés y yo creo que hay dos grandes herramientas en la formación de las y los internacionalistas, de las y de los científicos sociales de nuestra era, que son, además de la inteligencia artificial, lo platicábamos antes de entrar, son los idiomas. Una gran herramienta. Entonces, qué mejor ejercicio que escuchar su presentación en inglés y desde luego le pueden hacer las preguntas por escrito en francés, en inglés, en español. I think you agreed to have trilingual questions, profesor Morin. En el ciclo de conferencias, grandes protagonistas de las ciencias políticas y sociales, tiene como propósito reunir en nuestra facultad algunas de las figuras más destacadas del pensamiento contemporáneo en disciplinas como la administración pública, la antropología, las ciencias de la comunicación, la ciencia política, las relaciones internacionales y la sociología. Se trata de un espacio de diálogo académico que busca reflexionar críticamente sobre los grandes desafíos globales de nuestro tiempo y fortalecer la vocación internacional y plural de nuestra comunidad. En este marco, nos honra profundamente contar con la presencia del doctor Jean-Frédéric Morin, uno de los académicos más relevantes en el estudio de la gobernanza global y la economía política internacional. Por cierto, curso que me encanta dar todos los segundos semestres. A lo largo de su destacada carrera académica, ha contribuido de manera decisiva a comprender los procesos de negociación, cooperación y regulación internacional en un contexto mundial marcado por crecientes interdependencias y desafíos transnacionales. ¿Cómo no lo vamos a recibir con honores cuando tenemos tantas cuestiones que discutir sobre la era digital, entre otros grandes temas, y la revolución industrial que esto implica? Sus investigaciones y publicaciones constituyen hoy una referencia obligada para quienes quieren estudiar la gobernanza global y las transformaciones contemporáneas del sistema internacional. Además, su trabajo resulta especialmente pertinente para las y los estudiantes e investigadores, no solamente de relaciones internacionales, sino de las ciencias sociales en general, que se recrean en esta facultad. Y nos ofrecen herramientas analíticas fundamentales para pensar los desafíos de la cooperación internacional en temas como el medio ambiente, el espacio ultraterrestre y los nuevos bienes comunes globales. El doctor Morin, con una línea multipiniana, aquí estudiamos a Robert Gilpin, profesor, es uno de los autores, yo diría, no un must, pero un clásico de la economía política internacional, y él articula un trabajo académico desde diversos enfoques teóricos y materiales para explicar las múltiples fuerzas que operan en el mundo, dejando de lado fronteras arbitrarias disciplinares. No obstante, el papel del Estado es central para nuestro invitado, extendiéndolo a partir de su interacción con otros actores y procesos como el medio ambiente o la economía. Dicha relación es cíclica y dependiendo del periodo o etapa histórica, un actor puede preceder o imponer al otro y viceversa. La presencia del doctor Morin en nuestra facultad también busca construir lazos académicos con nuevos aliados, así como proyectar nuevas interlocuciones en Norteamérica más allá de Estados Unidos. Let's move to Canada, incluso Europa. Yes, we love Europeans, but we now love more the Canadians. Hago votos porque esta conferencia abrirá un nuevo capítulo de colaboración entre nuestra facultad y la Escuela Canadiense de Relaciones Internacionales. Estoy seguro que su conferencia será una oportunidad invaluable para el intercambio de ideas y para enriquecer nuestra reflexión colectiva sobre el presente y el futuro de la gobernanza global. Dejo la palabra a Alma y in a second she will give you the floor. Gracias.
Agradecemos las palabras de nuestro director y enseguida damos el uso de la voz al maestro Marco Antonio Lopátegui Torres.
Doctor Alejandro Chanona, doctor Jean-Frédéric Morin, maestro Edgar Maqueda. Good morning, everyone. It is a real pleasure to welcome you all this morning, students, colleagues, professors, and all of those who are following us through the faculty's social media channels here in Mexico and abroad. It is a particular honor to host today within our Grandes Protagonistas de las Ciencias Sociales lecture series, part of our faculty's 75th anniversary commemorations, Professor Jean-Frédéric Morin of Université Laval in Quebec. Professor Morin is one of the most influential voices working today at the intersection of international institutions, environmental governance, and political economy of global rule-making. He will be delivering the keynote lecture titled The Fragmentation of Global Governance, Implications for Foreign Policy. Jean-Frédéric Morin is a professor of international relations at Laval University, Quebec, Canada, and the founding director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Research on Global Governance. He held the Canada Research Chair in International Political Economy from 2014 to 2024 and was a professor at the ULB from 2008 to 2014. His research examines the institutions, networks, and dynamics that shape global governance, with a special focus on environmental governance, outer space, and the regulation of emerging global commons. Morin is an associate editor of the journal Earth System Governance and member of the editorial board of Global Environmental Politics. He has published over 75 peer-reviewed articles in prestigious journals, including International Studies Quarterly, the Review of International Organizations, and the European Journal of International Relations. Additionally, he has collaborated as a reviewer for more than 35 journals. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Dr. Morin. Thank you for being here.
Buenos días. And muchas gracias por la invitación. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. And it's an honor also to celebrate the anniversary of your faculty with you. So, feliz cumpleaños. But judging by my accent in Spanish, I think it's better if I switch to English. It's better for all of us. I would like to begin this talk by acknowledging how relevant it is to discuss global governance here in Mexico. And as you know, Mexico sits at the interface between multiple spheres. It connects North America to Latin America. It connects the Atlantic to the Pacific realms. And I think this strategic positioning enables Mexico to act as a bridge across regions, across coalitions, and across different issue areas. And I'll come back to this specific point later in my talk. The topic of my talk is fragmentation of global governance and its implication for foreign policy. And this is a topic that has generated considerable debate over the last few years, but I think especially over the last few months, because it has become obvious to everyone that multilateralism is under crisis. But I think too often, fragmentation of global governance is seen as a problem that needs to be fixed. We're told that global governance has become too dispersed, too incoherent, and that we need stronger multilateral institutions. I think this is a view that is widely shared, including among those of us who care about international law, and I am one of those who care about international law. Because basically, an international legal system functions best when it is integrated and when it is coherent. It's also a view that is shared by many in my generation. I was educated in the 90s when multilateralism was thriving. Several important multilateral treaties were adopted in the 90s. Several new intergovernmental organizations were established in the 90s. Think about the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Think about the Rio Summit in 1992, where the UN Convention for Climate Change was adopted. The Convention on Biological Diversity was adopted. Think about the International Criminal Court. So in many ways, the 90s was kind of the golden age of global governance, the golden age of multilateralism. But those were the 90s, and I don't think it's possible to come back in time. The 90s are behind us for the better or for the worse. So what I would like to do with you today is to question some of those assumptions. and to take a step back. I will not dispute the diagnostic in a sense that I think global governance is indeed today in 2026, it is highly fragmented. However, I will challenge the prescription and I will argue that fragmentation, and more precisely complexity, is not necessarily a problem that needs to be fixed. I think under certain conditions, it can even be a strength, provided that foreign policy experts adapt to this new situation and learns to benefit from this complexity. So my talk will have mainly 4 different points and I will address them in sequence. So the first point here that you see on the screen, global governance is becoming increasingly complex. Second, this complexity creates opportunities in terms of innovation, in terms of adaptation, and in terms of resilience. Third, complexity works best when it is embedded in a certain type of multilateral infrastructure. And fourth, complexity has important implication for foreign policy making. And I think universities like this one and students like many of you are should, I think, take into account those important implications when you're thinking about your role in your future career. And I'll give examples coming mainly from global environmental politics because this is what I know best. But I think many of the arguments that I will make are equally valid in other domains of global governance, in security, in trade, and in other issue areas. Okay, so let me begin with the first claim. Global governance is becoming increasingly complex. I think it's widely acknowledged that multilateralism is under strain. And this crisis, however, cannot be attributed solely to the disengagement of the Trump administration. I think the crisis results from deeper structural tension that had long been present in international cooperation. I think one of those structural weaknesses at the core of multilateralism is the ambition participation dilemma. I think it's very difficult to design institutions that are both highly ambitious in their commitment and broadly inclusive in their membership. In practice, most international institutions resolve this dilemma by sacrificing one dimension over the other. So what we have is a few multilateral institutions that are widely participatory, but relatively modest in their ambition. And at the same time, we have ambitious arrangements that are negotiated only among a small group of like-minded countries. So let me illustrate this with 2 examples, and you already have the first example. Well, now you have the 2 examples right in front of you. So on the first figure on your left, what you see is the number of COP decision adopted every year. So I'm sure everyone in the room here, you're familiar with the climate COP. COP stands for the Conference of the Party. You know that there's a conference basically every year on climate, and at those COPs, they do adopt decisions. But this is just the climate COP. There's also the biodiversity COP that some of you might be familiar with. But again, this is just a second COP. In fact, there are hundreds of different environmental COPs. They do meet almost every year, and they generate decisions, they adopt decisions on a yearly basis. What you can see from the first graph here on your left is that global environmental governance is incredibly productive. Yet, most of those decisions, they are not legally binding, and they're relatively modest in their substance. They have limited ambition. So what you have on the left, on the left part of the screen is broad participation, but limited ambition. On the figure on your right, what you're seeing is almost the opposite. What you see is the adoption for every given year. You have the number of new bilateral treaty governing the environment. So what you see is that I mean, you all know a few multilateral environmental agreements. You know the Paris Agreement, you know the Kyoto Protocol. Perhaps you know a few other big multilateral environmental agreements. The Montreal Protocol, for example, addressing the ozone layer. But those are only a few big trees in a very wide and large forests. And this forest is made mainly of bilateral agreements. My team and I, we have identified nearly 3,000 bilateral environmental treaties. And we find new ones every day. Those bilateral environmental treaties are very specific. They are, for many of them, quite ambitious, but they are very limited in their membership. It's a bilateral agreement. It's only two parties, two states. So taking these together, these two figures highlight, I think, a broader trend. Even if ambitious multilateralism is rare, the number of international institutions is increasing, especially either soft law multilateral institution or minilateral, regional, bilateral institutions. What we don't really have these days are ambitious multilateral institutions. And I think, should I stop? Do we need to? Okay, good. So I think this is not unique to the environment. We see a similar pattern in different fields of global governance, in trade, in investment, in space governance, in banking, in global health. And as the number of institutions is increasing, there's no central authority to coordinate all of those treaties, all of those institutions. In the environment, there's a key multilateral organization called the United Nations Environmental Program, but it's not really a coordinator. It's not really an orchestrator of this overall system. Even within the United system, there are other multilateral organizations that are very important to govern the environment. You have UNESCO, so the United Nations Organization for Education, Science, and Culture. You have the Food and Agricultural Organization. You have the International Maritime Organization. And those are the main multilateral environmental organization within the UN system, but you have many other organizations relevant for the environment that are outside of the UN system. Think about the Antarctic Treaty System. Think about the International Whaling Commissions. Those are important institutions, but outside of the UN. So basically, we don't have a single center of gravity in global environmental governance. But importantly, this lack of this absence of a central authority does not mean the absence of coordination, because there is coordination. We have various institutions that overlap, that they interact, and they do influence each other. We have coordination that emerged from basically a bottom-up process through self-organization. I'll give you an example, a very important example, coming from the Montreal Protocol. So the Montreal Protocol was adopted in the 80s to address one problem, which is the ozone layer, which is a different problem from climate change. And initially, this Montreal Protocol had unintended consequences for climate change because substances that replace the ozone depleting chemicals were very often greenhouse gases. So basically, while the Montreal Protocol was attacking one problem, the depletion of the ozone layer, it contributed indirectly to exacerbate another problem, which is climate change. So recently, the Montreal Protocol was amended to address those other substances that are greenhouse gases. No one said it's not the UN, General Secretary, it's not UNEP, it's not the Secretary of the UN that mandated the Montreal Protocol to better take climate into coordination. This coordination emerged through the interaction between the ozone and the climate governance system. And this is not an exception. In this figure, what you see, every single dot is a multilateral environmental agreement. There are hundreds of them. And each link connecting those dots is a citation from one treaty to another, because treaties are taking into account what is happening elsewhere in the global governance system. So what you see is a dense network of cross-references with more than 1,000 citations identified across these agreements. It's just an illustration that environmental agreements are not operating in silos. They take into account what is happening elsewhere in the system. So you have a high level of interconnection and and mutual awareness among institutions. In short, what you see here is a system characterized by a multiplicity of institutions, by a low degree of centralization, and by a high level of interconnectivity. And I will argue that global environmental governance, and perhaps increasingly global governance in general, function as a complex system. And by complex system, I do not mean a complicated system. It's very important to distinguish complex system from a complicated system. A complicated system is like a machine, it's a car, it's a clock. It has multiple components. It's hard to understand how it works. I do not understand how really a clock works. But it's possible to understand how it works by examining each individual parts separately. Complicated systems are difficult to understand, but they are inert, they are linear, and they are predictable. Complex system, in contrast, are a system where you have multiple interactions between different components, and those interactions generate outcomes that cannot be easily predicted only by looking at the properties of the components alone. So example of complex systems are the stock market, a jazz band, it's a complex system, an ecosystem is a complex system, your brain is a complex system, beehives is a complex system. So take your brain. You cannot understand how a brain really works only by looking at individual parts, only looking at neurons, for example. You can study neurons all your life, but that will not, teach you, or you will not learn how thoughts emerge and how being a conscious being actually works only by studying neurons. Same for a beehive. So you can look at the bee and study bees all your life, but it will not tell you how a collection of bees, a beehives, actually behave and adapt to change in the ecosystem. And importantly, there is no central coordinator in a complex system. You don't have in your brain like the chief neurons telling all the other neurons what to think. For bees, well, one of them is called the queen, but she does not decide anything, right? She's not telling what to do to the other bees. So a complex system is a system that is dynamic, that is alive, and that is hard to predict because it changes out of the interaction between the different components. It changes its own structure. And I think when we observe global governance through this lens, what we see is not merely the accumulation of institutions, but the emergence of systems whose behavior is shaped by interactions, by feedback loops, and by adaptive processes. Now, let me turn to the second claim, that complexity creates opportunities. Admittedly, complexity is also associated with drawbacks. Complexity increases the cost of coordination, for example, as actors must navigate multiple institutions and overlapping mandates. Complexity also leads to inconsistencies, since different institutions adopt different rules and different standards. And complexity may also enable powerful actors to engage in forum shopping by selecting the venue that best serves their interest. Those drawbacks are real and they should not be diminished. However, focusing solely on those drawbacks provide, I think, an incomplete picture and arguably a misleading picture. Complexity also provides opportunities, opportunities that are often overlooked, I think, in policy debates. And one of those important benefits of complexity is increased innovation. In a centralized system, innovation is hard, innovation is difficult, because any change requires broad agreement among a large number of actors with diverse preferences. By contrast, in a decentralized system, smaller group of actors can experiment with new ideas, with institutional design, and these experiments can then take place in, for example, in bilateral agreements, in minilateral clubs, in informal arrangements, where negotiation costs are lower and where political risks are more manageable. In my own research, I found that regulatory innovation often emerge in those smaller, informal, or smaller settings. One of the most important innovative agreements of the recent years on climate is an agreement that perhaps you never heard of. It's called the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade, and Sustainability. It was concluded by New Zealand, Switzerland, Iceland, and Costa Rica. It is highly innovative, and I think at one point it will spread, and other agreements will be adopted following this model. Another example of an innovative agreement is the side agreement, the environmental side agreement that was adopted between Mexico, the United States, and Canada with the original NAFTA agreement. So when NAFTA was first concluded, the original one, the first one from the early 90s, it was adopted with a joint side agreement, specifically looking at the environment. It was a highly innovative agreement. And in both cases, these agreements were introduced new norms, new practices that would have been impossible to achieve at the multilateral level. Now, a second opportunity created by complexity is learning and adaptation, because complex systems facilitate learnings through experimentation. When you have different institutions pursuing different approach, it's kind of a test. You have multiple trials. You can test different things, and actors can observe what works and what doesn't work. And successful practices can be replicated in other contexts. And each component of the system can adapt at their own pace, precisely because it does not require the consent of 200 different states. Minilateral agreements are more frequently revised, amended, updated than large multilateral institutions. And as a result, effective ideas can spread relatively quickly across the system. And this diffusion helps maintain some degree of order in the complex system. The diffusion of environmental provision in trade agreements provide a good example, and this is the example that you have here on the screen. So what you're seeing here is the diffusion of environmental provision in trade agreement. As I told you, the NAFTA side agreement for the environment was highly innovative. One of the innovation that was included in this agreement was a requirement for public participation in environmental lawmaking, in environmental decision-making. So if you look at 1995, you have 3 different dots. This is Mexico, United States, and Canada. And only one agreement in the world, only one treaty in the world had that specific provision. It was this NAFTA side agreement. But what you can see over time is that this same provision was basically copy-pasted. It was literally copied in other trade agreements. And you see first in 2005, 2010, 2015, you see this diffusion of this particular provision in the trade system. It was never integrated at the WTO, at the World Trade Organization. It was duplicated mainly in bilateral trade agreement. But once you have hundreds of bilateral agreements having a certain provision, it's legally speaking, it's roughly more or less the same as having a single semi-universal multilateral agreement. So I think this is how we can solve the ambition participation dilemma that I mentioned earlier. We start with either modest ambition or with just a few participants, and then we leverage the power of complexity to grow over time and to increase either in participation or in ambition. We first experiment, and then we scale up to achieve something that is similar to a multilateral agreement, except that it's not a multilateral agreement. It's a network of bilateral or regional agreements. The third benefit of complexity is resilience. Complex systems are more resilient because they do not rely on a single point of coordination. If one institution becomes ineffective or is weakened, other institution can compensate. What may appear as a redundancy from an efficiency perspective becomes a source of robustness from a systemic perspective. More centralized systems are often more vulnerable. They are more vulnerable to what? To administrative mismanagement, to regulatory capture, to groupthink, and to political pressure coming from dominant powers. In contrast, if you have a more decentralized system, you're less dependent on any single actor. And in the case of global environmental governance, I think global environmental governance is particularly decentralized. And the disengagement of the US did not lead to a collapse of global environmental governance. Instead, the system continues through the activities of multiple institutions. It operates at different level with the result that the US can paralyze the WTO. It can place the WTO, so the World Trade Organization. It could place the World Health Organization under financial strain. It can coerce UNESCO. It can undermine the International Court of Justice, but it cannot exert the same level of influence over global environmental governance because it is much more decentralized than these other international regimes. So the US could withdraw from the Paris Agreement, but overall, the global climate regime remains in place. And the US remain also a party to the Montreal Protocol, and I already told you that the Montreal Protocol is one of the most important treaty for climate governance. So taking together these observations suggest that complexity is not simply a problem to be solved, it's a resource that can be leveraged to improve global governance. And for decades, I think the lack of centralization in global environmental governance was seen as a problem that needs to be fixed. And this logic led several policymakers to advocate for the creation of stronger multilateral organization. Let's create a world environmental organization. More recently, some leaders, especially in Europe, were advocating to create a global pact for the environment. The logic was to let's have more centrality in global environmental governance. It will make global environmental governance stronger. But in retrospect, I think it is fortunate that those policy proposals failed. We do not have a World Environmental Organization, and I think it's a good thing for the environment. I think certainly the fact that we have a complex systems generate redundancies, but I think redundancies are a fair price to pay to get innovation, to get adaptation, and to get resilience. I think complexity, long criticized as a weakness for global environmental governance, now appears perhaps as its greatest strength. The challenge, therefore, is not to eliminate complexity, but to manage complexity in ways that can maximize its benefit while managing its drawback. And this brings me to my third claim. If complexity creates opportunities, does that mean that we should abandon multilateralism in favor of decentralized arrangements? And I think the answer is no. Complexity requires a shared foundation rooted in multilateralism in order to function effectively. The issue is not whether multilateral institutions, whether we need them or not, but what kind of multilateral institutions we need and what function should they perform within a decentralized system. And I argue that multilateral institutions remain essential for 4 key functions. Next slide, please. First, multilateralism should define broad universal principles. These principles provide a shared understanding that enables coordination among decentralized initiatives. Without such common foundation, actors would not have a shared language. They would not have reference points for cooperation. In climate governance, for example, one of those key principles is the common but differentiated responsibility principle, and it offers a good example where actors could agree, and on this basis, they could negotiate more specific commitments. But at least they have this baseline agreement. Second, we need multilateral forums where knowledge can be produced, can be shared, and could be debated. I think information knowledge should circulate. Scientific expertise must interact. Scientists should interact with policymakers. In the environment, we have institutions like the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC, that you, I'm sure, know about, but it's not the only one. We have others. IPBES is another example for biodiversity. Those are organizations that are really at the interface between science and policymaking, and we need those institutions to create a common knowledge base on which political decisions can be based. Third, multilateral institutions are essential for monitoring. In a system that is characterized by multiple experiments and initiatives, it is necessary to assess progress and evaluate progress. And this requires data collection, analysis, dissemination. In our environment, one important tool for monitoring is to use remote sensing by satellites. And this is one of the reasons why in recent years I've been increasingly interested in space governance. Because from outer space, from satellites, you can monitor deforestation, you can monitor the emission of methane, for example, and a number of different other substances. And I think it is key, it is important that monitoring function is being conducted by actors that are seen as neutral, that are seen as legitimate, and those could be and should be multilateral institutions. And fourth, even in the decentralized system, we need mechanisms to resolve disputes. Conflicts are inevitable, especially when we have multiple institutions that are operating in parallels. And multilateral framework can provide procedures and practices, forums to address those disagreements in a predictable and in a legitimate manner. At the same time, I do not believe that multilateral institutions are always the most effective venues for rule settings. I think transnational, bilateral, regional, minilateral initiatives are often more dynamic, more flexible for rule settings. They can move more quickly, they can experiment, they can be revised, they adapt more easily to changing circumstances, to new knowledge. And I think it's entirely possible to have a system based on some multilateral central institutions for monitoring, for dispute settlement, but also having a more decentralized system for rulemaking and rule setting. And so I think in this sense, multilateral institutions and regional, bilateral, multilateral institutions are not in tension, they are not competing tracks, they are complementary in various ways. Okay, so let me now turn to the final part of my talk, what this complexity means for foreign policy making, and what does it mean for you as students who are getting ready to have some influence over this world. The first implication is that complexity requires greater investment in monitoring. I think in a complex system, relevant information is dispersed across multiple institutions and actors. And diplomats, policymakers, they must follow a wide range of processes often simultaneously across different issue areas, and this significantly increased the need for specialized expertise and analytical capacities. Second, the second application concerns the nature of expertise itself. In complex systems, linear reasoning and reliance on past experiences can be very misleading. In a complex system, because the complex systems are always changing, it makes prediction, as I said, very difficult. So I think policymakers, and including you, some of you will be future policymakers, you need to be comfortable with uncertainty. You need to learn to be comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. And you must be willing to revise your assumption as new information becomes available. We need, in short, fewer dogmatic thinkers. We need more Bayesian thinkers. The third implication is both temporal and spatial. In complex system, the most significant effects of decisions are often indirect and delayed. And decisions taken in one institutional context can generate consequences in other, sometimes far removed places in time and space. And this requires policymakers to adopt a broader perspective, one that goes beyond the immediate outcome and takes into account longer term and cross-sectoral effects. And the fourth implication relates to strategies. When you have a system that is highly centralized and hierarchic, influence is often exercised through formal authority and institutional position. But in a network system, by contrast, influence depends more on connectivity, on structural positioning within the network. Actors that occupy bridging positions between different clusters can play a key role in circulating ideas, facilitating coordination, and shaping outcomes. And this suggests that foreign policy should not focus exclusively on major powers, on central institutions. I think smaller, medium power actors located at the intersection of different networks can be highly influential. And this brings me to the point that I mentioned in the introduction regarding the position of Mexico. Next slide. Yes, stay there for a minute. In a multilateral setting, this is me trying to express what multilateralism look like. When you have a multilateral setting, monitoring is relatively easy. It's relatively straightforward, and network position really does not matters, let's say, much less. Next slide. But in a decentralized and complex system like this one, a country like Mexico must not only monitor its own bilateral relation. Here you see Mexico has just two bilateral relation, but it must also monitor what's going on overall in the broader system. So next slide. Yes. It must also position itself strategically within the broader network of institutions and partnerships. And from this perspective here, Mexico appeared to occupy a particularly advantageous position, as you can see, because it connects different regional, different thematic cluster. And this is really a bridging position, allowing not only to learn from different diverse partners, but also to diffuse its own lessons across multiple clusters. Next slide. So by strengthening its connection, and here you have an example with, this is just an example among others, but here you have South Africa. By strengthening its connection with a country like South Africa, in this figure, Mexico can, as you can see, further extend its reach into additional cluster and increase in its influence. And this influence, next slide, is not limited only to the direct partners. It operates indirectly through second-order, third-degree connections, amplifying its impact across the broader system. So let me conclude. Global governance is becoming increasingly complex in the sense that it involves a growing number of institutions, interconnected institutions, without central authority. This complexity creates challenges, including inefficiencies and coordination problems. However, it also creates opportunities, particularly in terms of innovation, adaptation, resilience. And to harness those opportunities, complexity needs to be supported by multilateral institutions that provides a common vocabulary, facilitate coordination, and enables feedback loops to function properly. And for foreign policy makers, this transformation requires, I think, new skills, new strategies, and new ways of thinking about international influence. Rather than seeking to eliminate fragmentation, rather than hoping that we will be back in the 90s, we won't. We must learn to benefit from complexity. Muchas gracias.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Professor Morin. Ahora vamos a dar paso a las preguntas. Después de esta brillante exposición. So, Carlos Lara asks, given the historical pattern of multilateral institutions being shaped by hegemonic interest, USA and allies, how can climate governance framework like the COPs structurally prevent powerful actors from using procedural consensus to impose their own development models on the global south? Okay. Another one from our dearest professor, Agata Prechko. Given that COP decisions are mostly not legally binding, what do you think about the growing use of green conditionality in the financial assistance systems provided by institutions such as the IMF with its resilience and sustainability facility and the World Bank? Do you see this as an opportunity, a risk, or both? Considering that many of the countries subject to these conditions have contributed little to the climate crisis. And finally, what's your take on the conflicts of USA, Palestine, Iran, and Israel? What should we do? What can we do about US imperialism?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for those questions. In a way, they help me make my own argument even stronger. So the first question about the influence of the hegemonic power of the U.S. In climate governance, I think several people working on climate were not that disappointed that if U.S. government withdrew from the Paris Agreement, or even and especially from the UN. So as you probably know, the U.S. first withdrew from the Paris Agreement, and then it withdrew from the UNF, so United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. If you just withdrew from the Paris Agreement, you are still a party to the UNFCCC, meaning that you can still attend COP, and you're still part of this consensus-seeking process. But if you remove yourself from the UNFCCC, perhaps negotiation will be easier, because we don't need the U.S. to be part of the consensus. There's a reason, by the way, why several fossil fuel powers and all the OPEC members are part of the UNFCCC. It's also to influence the organization from the inside. And the US for a long time was successful in influencing the climate COP from the inside. Now it's not inside anymore, and perhaps negotiation will be easier. But my main point is that we should not put all our eggs in the same basket. That even though the media, they all talk mainly, I mean, they become semi-obsessed when there's a climate COP, as if it was the only thing that is happening on climate at the international level. But it's not.
There are several other initiatives that are taking place. Just recently in Colombia, you had this negotiation among a group of like-minded countries to talk about fossil fuels and how to remove ourselves from fossil fuels. Perhaps I don't know if you are aware of this, but for decades, at Climate COP, parties were not talking about fossil fuels. It was kind of a taboo. They were talking about climate, but not fossil fuels. Now we have this parallel negotiation on fossil fuel, but it is outside of the UN system. It's outside of the COP system. So basically, my argument is that fine, there's the COP and there's the UNFCCC, but let's have multiple institutions and see which one works, and perhaps start from there instead of having all of them in one basket. So I don't think that the withdrawal of the U.S. from the UNFCCC is necessarily a bad thing from climate. But I also don't put all my hopes on the climate COP. Now, green conditionality and the IMF. This also is useful to make my point, because I think the IMF was in a better position to impose its conditionality in the 80s and to a certain extent in the 90s. But those were really where structural reforms were imposed on a number of developing countries, as you might know. Today, there are other institutions and there are alternatives for several developing countries. They can turn to either alternative governments or alternative regional agency. Speaking about the World Bank, this is not only the only main actor, it's not the only development bank in the world. We saw in the last decade or so a number of other initiatives similar to the World Bank, but with a regional scope. So it creates competition. It creates competition. The IMF and the World Bank are not the only it's not the only game in town. And I think this competition is beneficial for developing countries. And I would not be surprised if there's a causal link between this increased competition among development banks and more favorable conditions for developing countries. The third question on U.S., Palestine, Israel, what should we do? Well, I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that very difficult question. If I had the answer, I would be very happy and we would be fortunate. But yeah, I don't see an easy answer and an easy solution for this problem.
Thank you very much. We have two more questions. Professor Selene, and the last one, because we're closing the lecture. Professor Selene Romero asks, facing global governance fragmentation, what's your opinion on the role of feminists' foreign policies? And another person asks, you said that when an actor like the US leaves a multilateral organization in a decentralized system, the absence does not remove the broader agenda. The broader agenda organization. My question: when the actor state like that is leaving the organization represents the majority of the financial support, tools, knowledge, skills, etc., like the case of the US, does its absence, although it does not eliminate the agenda, has a similar effect? Thank you.
Okay. I'll answer those two questions together because I think it's important to have a longitudinal approach. I think we should let go the goal of having the important players making commitments, making far-reaching, ambitious commitments. I think we can make progress more easily. That was the point of my talk, by experimenting here and there. And over time, those experiments, other actors will join in, what started as a unilateral agreement can become a multilateral agreement eventually, or could increase in its degree of ambition. The example of a feminist foreign policy is an interesting one. In Canada, the previous government, led by the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, claimed to have a feminist foreign policy. And as soon as there was a change of government, a new prime minister from the same political party, again, the Liberals, they decided that they won't have a feminist foreign policy anymore. Nevertheless, the Trudeau government had enough time to experiment. What does it mean to have a foreign trade agreement, for example? A feminist trade agreements. What does it mean to include provisions related to indigenous population in a trade agreement, for example? So they did experiment. But they were not the only one. Chile also experiment in including gender provision in its trade agreement. But again, I think it's best if it does not rely, on the change. There's a vulnerability, as we saw in Canada. As soon as there's a change of government, the agenda disappeared. But because we experiment in some institutions and negotiators are paying attention, what are the innovative agreements, the innovative provisions, we see those provisions being replicated. And now we're talking about gender at the WTO in a multilateral organization. I think it would have been impossible to talk about gender at the World Trade Organization if there were not those experiments done by Chile, by Canada, and others a few years prior. We did a study for environmental governance. We looked at agreements that successfully attracted new parties and successfully increased in the level of ambition over time. And we are seeing that there's many of those agreements. So we should not hope to get the main players, the big powers in the room and to have ambitious provision from the start. I think this is a unrealistic goal. I think a better strategy is to start small, but make sure to have key ingredients to grow over time in participation and in ambition. Thank you.
Professor Jean-François Morin, Dr. Morin, allow me to give you, on behalf of the faculty, this diploma for your keynote lecture. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to give you this as a gift for our anniversary. Roseanne Cans, correctly speaking, please.
Oh,
may I?
Sure, please.
Okay.
I don't even have one from my own university. So I'll wear this one at my university.
Yes.
And I haven't received a diploma for many years.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Muchas gracias, profesor Jean-Frédéric Morin. Venga más seguido a México. Gracias y buenas tardes a todos.
Gracias.